This is Three Brothers Movie Reviews, and we just saw Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the ninth film written and directed by Quentin Tarantino. The film takes place in the year 1969, and it follows two characters, one named Rick Dalton and another named Cliff Booth. Rick is an actor who works on a cowboy TV show, which has since been canceled, and in the meantime, he is looking for work in Hollywood. Cliff Booth is his stunt double, who is working alongside of him, and they're both making their way through Hollywood trying to work through different jobs. But at the same time, we're following Sharon Tate, an actual actress in real life, who was the victim of a horrible incident in the 1960s. So we have a bit of a cross between reality and a bit of fiction thrown in there for fun, and it's Quentin Tarantino. So yeah, to start this out, I'm a huge fan of Quentin Tarantino. I will never forget the first time I watched Pulp Fiction. Just being blown away by the dialogue and the scenes that just drew me in. I was describing this to you, Tarantino is so good at making dialogue feel normal, but at the same time fascinating, and that's what I've loved about all of his movies. I've seen all of his movies, and this is probably my most anticipated movie of the year. So, and I swear, we just went out to get burgers. We were walking around for a bit. We got some burgers. We talked about this. We've been racking our brains around this. We're divided,
right?
But just initial thoughts from you, Dan. What did you think overall about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood?
Well, it's interesting because you kind of outlined that you're a big Tarantino fan. You've seen all his movies. I would not classify myself as a Tarantino fan. I haven't seen most of his movies. I think this is only the second movie of his I've seen in theaters, and I think fourth I've seen in full. I've seen some of his other movies in pieces, but I haven't sat down and watched more than 4 of his movies in full.
Yeah.
So I think that largely I liked the movie. I think that it has one of the things we can talk about a little later is in terms of maybe some of its weaknesses. I do think that those are there, but I did find myself entertained and interested throughout the movie. Ultimately, there is this interesting interplay between real people who have real life counterparts and creations of solely Quentin Tarantino, primarily Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio's characters. And I think that the strange thing is that those characters feel the most like characters. They have the most fleshed out stories, their experiences, their stories ultimately drive things forward. But what's interesting is that I feel like the people that are real life, they don't feel purely like cardboard cutouts. There's little details that make them feel like people, even though they're not explored as characters in the story.
The trouble is you would need to have them engage in conversations. There's a scene with Steve McQueen, and he's at a party. He shares dialogue with another character, but you don't get much of that with Sharon Tate or with much of the other characters. They don't. This is what I was thinking halfway through. Inglourious Bastards actively makes fun of history, changes drastically changes crucial events that would change the world if they were to have actually happened in reality. And I was I almost felt like this movie was afraid to do that, until a certain point in the film where they do change certain things. But it's like they were worried about doing that with the subject material, and it makes sense. You have the victims of the families and stuff like that are still around. There's a lot of things that are troublesome when you're handling that type of material, but I feel like you could have done a better job making them feel more like characters if you could have changed certain things, maybe.
Right. I disagree that they needed that, though. I think that what they did was mainly have characters who do have real life counterparts. And what's interesting is rather than making them the drivers of their own character, there's really only a handful of scenes where those people actually feel like you're kind of in their shoes. I think the key scene for Margot Robbie's character is she's in a movie theater watching a movie that she is actually an actress in, and she's just kind of enjoying herself, looking up at the movie screen, enjoying the laughter when she's on screen and she does something. She's just enjoying the fact that people enjoy her work.
Yeah.
I think that outside of that, she feels largely as someone who's being observed.
Yeah.
Like, you're seeing her from afar, you're seeing her from other characters' eyes, and she's not really, that's why she's not a character. I don't think that's necessarily a problem. I think that for the role she has in the movie, it works.
Like I said, I figured she would be that when I went into this movie.
And that's the one thing that you'll need to be understanding of, is that the movie is largely a fairy tale. Like, the movie has the title Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and it largely sticks to that tone. It's a fantasy. It's not really a historical biopic in any respect of Roman Polanski, Sharon Tate, and the Manson murders. This is largely a fairy tale about two men, played by Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio, who are basically really close friends, and it's their experience working together, getting drunk together. Like, it's just kind of like they just kind of live life together. And what's interesting is we mapped this out. The movie is structured in a interesting way where the movie itself doesn't cover a lot of time overall. Like, it only covers maybe a few days.
Yeah.
But there is a time jump. There's a lot of stuff that ultimately, there's a lot of ground that's covered, even though like what you're actually watching doesn't cover a whole lot of distance.
Yeah, I was describing this to you, like, one of the things which, like, bothers me is, like, that, like, it doesn't feel like this movie has, like, a point that it is driving home. Like, I feel like in pretty much every single Tarantino movie there's something. Like, Operation Kino, I was describing this to you, is described pretty early on in Inglourious Basterds, like, maybe the halfway point, maybe a little bit before then.
Right.
There's a lot of setup, then you have that. And, like, you know, you have, like, all the stuff with in Django Unchained. That kind of follows, like, two different plots, but those are set up, like, really early. Like, you have one, then the other. It's kind of two different stories that go hand in hand.
Right.
It's like, in this movie, it doesn't feel like... You describe it almost feels like the movie doesn't have a plot. It's just characters going place to place. And like you said,
There's literally a scene in the middle of this movie where there's almost the dialogue itself is almost commenting on the film itself.
Yeah, it's
like, what's the story? It's like, oh, I'm not done with it yet. Like, the story, they're almost kind of pointing out the fact that, like, yeah, there's not a whole lot that's happened so far.
Which, you know, like I said, your mileage is going to vary depending on how much you like the characters and, like, if you find the movie boring or not. Right. And that's going to be kind of like our main point. We were talking a lot about, like, how you can, you know, maybe prove movies can be boring to an extent, because this is the trouble. Like, if a movie is boring, it's one of the most, like, subjective things in a film. Like, you can just have a great film. Like, I could see someone hating 12 Angry Men, and I think that movie is one of the best written films I've ever seen in my life. But I could see someone be like, well, nothing happens. It all takes place in one room. It's like, but what about the rest of the movie? What about the writing? Right. It's like, it's hard to quantify that exactly. And I'm like, like I was said, I would... Whenever I go to boring, I usually look at, like, bad editing or pacing. And I'm like, I would say those are present in this movie. But, like you said, even though all that happens, like, it's kind of the tone and, like, the characters that keep things interesting.
Yeah, I think that it's hard to agree on whether a movie is boring, because we just saw the same movie, and I think you largely thought that a large chunk of it was boring. Yeah. I did not. But I think what we can agree on is that the movie is unfocused.
Yes.
And whether that is a bad thing or a good thing can also shift. But I think you can agree on, is it unfocused? We were talking about two movies that this movie sort of reminds us of. One of them is Solo, a Star Wars story. The other is Hail Caesar. Yeah. Both of them are, well, I would say Hail Caesar is Hail Caesar is a closer counterpart.
Solo is what we were using to, I use that example of bad editing.
Okay, my bad. So, starting with Hail Caesar. If you haven't seen Hail Caesar, it's essentially a Coen Brothers movie about old Hollywood.
Yeah.
And it centers around a handful of characters who are kind of walking around the streets of this time, and they're involved in the movie business. And a lot of scenes in this movie, just like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, are dedicated to people in the movie business making movies. Yeah. Or screwing up making movies. And for the most part, you kind of meander around. Like, there is a kidnapping plot in Hail Caesar. And like in this movie, there is sort of the background. You know that things are heading towards the Sharon Tate house, since she's in the movie. Yeah. It's like having John F. Kennedy in a movie. You know, at some point, he's going to drive down to Dealey Plaza. Like, that's kind of like the thing that kind of like you're thinking about the whole time, even though there's these other things happening. But I think that both for me, in Hail Caesar and this movie, I would agree that the movie feels oftentimes rudderless, like it's not really going anywhere clear. Like Quentin Tarantino just seems to be having a fun time essentially recreating old 1960s movies with these like A-list Hollywood actors now. But I did enjoy myself. I did think it was entertaining. There were enough scenes that landed with a punch for me. Like there's a scene with Rick Dalton talking to this 8-year-old actress on set.
It's one of the best scenes in the movie.
It made me think about the fact that I'm like, have I ever seen like a kid actor in a Tarantino movie? And I can't think I have.
I said this like I've said this before. Like you don't see a lot of kids in Tarantino movies. I was thinking like
right,
like Django Unchained. There's like barely any. I was like I thought like why is that? I'm like kids are innocent. And, like you don't want them like around all like the violence and like I mean even in context of like his films themselves like there's not much of a purpose to have kids in them.
Right.
But I'm like it was a perfect scene for the kid to be in there and she was great. I was
she was really good.
I want to look her up.
Right.
She was one of the best parts of the movie. Yeah. So.
And like that scene was really cool because ultimately it felt the closest to a theme.
Yeah.
If this movie has a theme, which is Rick Dalton is this like big star who is starting to fall out of the sky. Mm-hmm. He's not the big guy. He's not the big actor he used to be. His main source of income now is showing up on pilots to TV shows where he's not the star. He's the bad guy that gets shot at the end by the good guy. And as Al Pacino kind of puts early on, like, basically you go on other shows to get your butt whipped.
Yeah.
And that's probably the closest thing this movie has to a theme where like you have Rick Dalton, who's the big star that everyone kind of like admires and they're like, oh, you're the cowboy from that show we used to love. And then you have Cliff, who's a stunt double that everyone who's not Rick seems to dislike or just dismiss. Yeah. But he's arguably the guy that Rick kind of wants to be.
Yeah.
He's just effortlessly cool. He's really pretty stable compared to Rick, who's like, he's an alcoholic. He's almost in a constant state of self-sabotage.
Yeah, like he's always smoking and just like coughing up his lungs. It's like exactly, it's like you can't handle them.
Like, it's like those two and their relationship and how they sort of counterbalance one another. That's probably the closest thing this movie has to a theme, even though it doesn't really play that through the whole element. But it feels like the strongest scenes in those movies focus on that. Focus on like what people kind of look at when they think about Hollywood at the time. Like, what do the people in this movie like think about when they think about the people they see on TV? They think about Rick Dalton, but Rick Dalton's a mess. It's a stunt double who's the stable guy. It's a stunt double who's actually the cool guy.
Yeah.
And nobody really notices him. Like, that's probably the closest this movie has to a theme. But I would agree that this movie's wildly unfocused if that is the theme. Yeah. Which maybe Quentin Tarantino doesn't think it's the theme. Maybe Quentin Tarantino just made this movie to be rudderless and to just kind of end up at this place where things get wildly explosive towards the end. And I don't know, is there stuff you want to talk about before we get to that point? We definitely want to talk about the end.
Do you want to spoil that? Like, talk about that?
We've talked about it enough. I mean,
we can put a marker on there.
Yeah,
like,
I think...
I want to just like give my point on like what I would say is the issue because like for me like I was talking to this about you like you're drawn a lot to characters and that's one of the reasons that you like this movie too like how the interaction with the characters like for me what I always love about Tarantino movies is the dialogue and how he just makes scenes flow really well and I was mentioning this too like Death Proof. A lot of people criticize that movie. I love it. I'm like I understand some of the criticisms towards it. I don't think it's perfect. I think it's one of his most problematic films, but I still think that movie is well put together because of how crisp the dialogue is and how it just is interesting. And like it's kind of similar to Django Unchained where it's excuse me, where it's in two bits that like it starts off in one section, then it kind of jumps to a different storyline,
right?
And everything just is fun. And I'm like, for me, my trouble with this movie comes down to the pacing, and it's like I was mentioning this to you, like there are so many scenes where characters will get into their cars, they'll drive and with listening to music and they'll get there. And I'm like, I've said this before, I think that you could make a really interesting film through visual storytelling of a character driving a car. I'm like, I've wanted to make one of those, but I'm sorry, there are so many scenes like that. You could make a montage easily 20 minutes worth of just driving scenes, and just like without any characters talking. I was just like, that for me just grew ridiculous. I was like, dude, just trim those down, man. I was like, please, Fred Raskin is doing the editing in this movie. I'm like, I felt there was so much of characters going place to place, but so little of characters going place to place and like talking to others about
what am I
things.
learning about these characters in the midst of watching them drive?
Yeah, it's almost like Rick, like something like Taxi Driver. Like I was saying, some of the bit, like the direction was similar to Martin Scorsese, but like Scorsese tackles like kind of, you know, character pieces, like they're very like centralized on one character. I'm like, I feel like this movie's kind of centralized on two characters, but at separate times. Like it's just them and them going through life, and it's like it can work.
You made a really good point. You made a point that one of the most attractive elements of going to a Tarantino movie is the dialogue.
Yeah.
And the dialogue is specifically on two characters talking to each other and having interesting conversations. This movie is unique because I think that it doesn't have a lot of that.
No, not many characters are like together at points. Like you said, like the scene with the 8-year-old is the scene with the best dialogue, and like it's not even between the two main characters. No. It's like they don't get much dialogue, but it's cool to see them get drunk together at a house and just like smoking cigarettes. That's
not
fun.
The 8-year-old. Not the 8-year-old.
Yeah, like
Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio get drunk together.
That's fun to see. But yeah, like the best scene is with like essentially an extra character, and it's like that for me is problematic when when you're not using your characters to like have them bounce off each other, because like, I mean, I'm fine if Tarantino wants to go on different paths, but like I think if he was trying to make a movie which felt more personal, I think he failed because of like how many characters there are and like how much the plot meanders. Because I'm like, I think this movie could have worked out a lot more like with what he was trying if they'd trimmed down the characters and like the runtime and made it a little more focused and feel, like you said, a little less rudderless. So
I think that's the interesting thing. Like, I think that both of us have a good argument to be made about this movie. I don't disagree with anything you've said, but basically everything that was boring for you, like all the scenes where it's like, oh, another scene where we're driving. Like, for me, I just enjoyed the mood the movie put me in. Yeah. Like, the movie kind of set this tone of welcome to 1969. Like, almost every scene in the movie has either music happening, whether it's non-diegetic is when it's not happening in the movie, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot of diegetic music.
Tons of that music,
where it's in the movie,
players.
And there's also a lot of televisions.
Yeah.
So almost every scene, there's a scene that happens on the ranch where Manson and his followers have kind of set up shop. There's a scene where you're not actually looking at the characters' faces in a scene, you're looking at them watching television. And that's almost how the entire scene plays out when it cuts back to them. You're seeing the cameras behind them and they're looking forward at the television. Like, I noticed that. Like, almost every scene has either a television in it or some kind of record player, radio. Like, you're almost constantly steeped in
music.
The music and the movies and the television of the time.
Yeah.
Which, making sense with kind of like your title, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, you were constantly surrounded by what it felt like to be in Hollywood at the time. And I think that for me, that made those scenes that would have otherwise been boring interesting. Because I felt like even if I wasn't engaging with the characters, even if I wasn't learning more about the characters, I always felt like I was being locked into that mood that was 1969 and this very specific kind of time capsule kind of element.
Did you want to transition into spoilers perhaps, like for the ending, or what do you...
I feel like we've kind of already kind of danced around spoilers, but do you want to clearly state spoilers since it's a new movie?
If you want, sure.
Yeah,
Like, well, all right.
I would like to talk about the ending.
I'll leave a note on like when the spoilers end. Like, but
Yeah.
from here on out, that we're gonna get into spoilers, especially for the ending. So if you don't want to know anything, just skip to the time that we'll give.
Largely speaking, if you like Tarantino movies, I would think you should see this. Would you agree with that? It's worth seeing.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so
I would always recommend.
we can start that off the bat, but now we're going to go into spoilers.
Here we go. So, do you want to just jump to the ending?
Yeah. So this end,
Okay.
essentially, like, this is the one thing that I just want to kind of start out with. I don't like most television or movie depictions of Charles Manson.
Yeah.
I just don't, because one of the things is if you read about certain serial killers, there are serial killers that do have some well-earned mystique about them.
Like Ted Bundy, like he's a very interesting
Right.
case study in like his past and like all that like happened within his life that built up to him, like who he was.
Yeah.
Because he seemed like a perfectly like Ed Gein, like he's someone like who seemed like a normal person, but when you like look in his house, you're like something was really really wrong
Right.
with this guy. Like Ted Bundy, there wasn't much to him that felt out of place.
It's why the new
And
movie,
it's like,
new movie with what's his name,
Zac Efron.
Zac Efron. That's why that new movie kind of looked interesting to me, is because it's not about that movie was not about Ted Bundy. It was about his girlfriend.
Yes.
And about how she saw him.
It's a very interesting story. If you like, I
Right.
haven't seen the movie, but I know all the story around that. That's fascinating.
So I think that's pretty cool. If you actually read about Charles Manson, he was none of those things.
No.
He wasn't mysterious. He wasn't attractive. He wasn't any sort of there was nothing mysterious or mystique about him. That was something that he just made up to get women to be willing to be around him. He was essentially just a con artist, a loser. Now, to be fair, had a horrible life, horrible upbringing, horrible mother, probably not much of a chance in the world. But I really don't like most depictions of Manson because they play him up as this like almost supernatural figure.
Something like the Joker almost. I've heard a
Yeah,
lot
they
of people
play him up as
compare
a
him to that.
supervillain. I'm like, he was not. And so any depiction that sort of plays up that mystique, I'm just like, you're falling into what he wants you to think about him.
Yeah.
It's not about what he actually was. It's about this
The legend, like you
fantasy
said.
and this legend. And so that's my issue going into this movie is I'm like, are you going to do that? And the movie doesn't.
I remember
He only shows up in one scene.
just one scene, like it's one of those things like that we talked about with Jackie Brown, like kind of muted dialogue, like with characters going in and out. But yeah, I remember asking you this. I was like, I asked you like, what percent did you think that like they would play everything exactly the same as how it happened in real life?
Right.
Because in the real life event that happened was Sharon Tate was 8 months pregnant.
Yep.
There were 3 other guests in the house.
They were
These
having a
people-
party.
Yeah, these people. There were 4 of them. One abandoned them and drove off with a car. You had them with one of them had a gun. The other 2 had knives. They were all supposed to go in there. They were ordered by Manson to kill everybody in the house, which they did. They stabbed him and they killed Sharon Tate.
Yeah.
So like reading all that story and like everything that surrounded it, like that was one of the things I was concerned about. First of all, this is the first Tarantino movie which is based on a true story. The only
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that.
Jackie Brown is based on a book. It's based on a book called Rum Punch. Other than that, all of his other movies are original or like significantly alter the events of history where they're not even based on anything like Inglourious
Right.
Bastards. But this movie is based on a true story, and there are characters who are exactly the same
Yeah.
as they are like who.
You have some characters that might even there are some characters that you're definitely still alive.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like those things. Like I was very concerned about them with this movie, and especially when I looked at all the cast, and I was like, But like for you, you said you were more. You figured they might play it up more. I was like, my assumption.
60% assumption that they were going to play things relatively straight.
I told you when I went into the movie with like a 30% chance. I figured Rick and Cliff were always going to interfere. My guess is that they were going to somehow be in the house that night, and that there
Right.
that somehow they would like stop events from happening, or they would like maybe some people would die. But I'm like, I didn't figure like they would have everything go out the same way. So
Yeah.
the way it
That
happens.
is not what happens.
No, instead, what happens is Rick and Cliff are getting drunk on a night with his Italian wife inside of the bedroom, like sleeping, and then like they get there and everything is played out the same way, but then Rick comes out in the car and tells them to leave.
Right.
They recognize him. They have this. This is one of the flaws for me. They have this ridiculous conversation where they just. It's one of those things where you just have to say these characters are just insane in order to rationalize it, but they just decide, like, they taught us violence, so let's kill them.
There was the guy next to us who had probably my favorite reaction in the whole movie as these characters are having this insane conversation about movie violence, where he's just like, Jesus Christ.
I was laughing so hard. I was like, oh my gosh, I wish that was in the movie.
It's honestly like how I was feeling, because I was simultaneously horrified because I know who these people are, these horrible murderous monsters, and they're having this ridiculous, very Tarantino-esque conversation about like movie violence and like crazy stuff, and like it was probably the most probably the most like clearly absurd moment of the movie.
Yeah.
Like just fully leaning into the absurdity of this.
Yeah, and then they get into the house and like Cliff and
they attack Rick's house.
Yeah, Cliff is like completely slammed. He's like smoking the acid dipped cigarette that the girl gave him.
That was so funny.
Yeah, and then he he lets the dog loose on these guys, and like everyone is killed in the most like crazy way. Like you have the girl who's like getting ripped apart by the dog, and then eventually is let out to the pool. Right. She's like shooting the gun in the air and won't stop freaking out until Rick flames.
Probably the most crowd pleasing moment of the whole movie is when there was literally like a Chekhov's gun of, Rick has a flamethrower from a movie he used to do, and he comes out with that and just torches this girl who's like her face is all mangled. She's shooting in the air. He just torches the front half of her that's still open in the pool.
The other thing I figured was the whole trick that Cliff had with his dog, and where he puts him before he feeds him, and I'm like, and he uses that to go against the guys, and like he eats his testicles off.
Oh man!
And then the woman with the knife, and then he slams her face.
He turns her face into mashed potatoes, man.
It's like. I remember you saying this, like, it's such a satisfying moment. It's like what you said, like, can you turn off the rest of the movie and just say, like, this is entertaining? I'm like, absolutely. Right. I'm like, that for me is like one of the most crazy moments in the film, which I love.
Pure crowd-pleasing fun.
Absolutely. But again, it's like they turn off reality. It's like the rest of the movie is like played that way, and then all of a sudden, like you said, it's like all of a sudden it's a fairy tale. Then it's that. Then like they have a conversation at the end, like with they're like, hey, do you want to come in for a drink? Where it's like, hey, everything's fine. And I'm just like,
That's literally how the movie ends. Like they walk in the house, empty driveway, credits.
Which is fine, but I wish they'd poured a little more into it. Like I wish they'd been consistent with the tone, because that just goes all out Tarantino, just all in one stretch for like 15 minutes,
which you haven't seen in the whole movie. Like that's really the only violence in the whole movie, outside of like on-set movie violence, which is pretty tame. That's it.
Yeah, it's like other than that, it's just there. So it's like it's strange to see that in such a massive burst, even though it's entertaining and satisfying to watch, knowing the story. But I'm like, what do you feel about that? Because
I think the movie pulled off a really clever trick, which is the movie made me think that I was watching, for all intents and purposes, a biopic that was just focused on these original characters, with the biopic stuff happening in the background.
Yeah.
But the title should have clued me in on this. This is purely a fairy tale.
Yeah.
This is purely a fairy tale that has really nothing to do with history, and the ending really drives that home. So I actually like the fact that the movie was able to essentially pull a subtle fast one on me, which is they made me think I was watching something that was real. A lot of my tension was, crap, I know where this is going, and this is going to suck because we're going to watch Sharon Tate get murdered and all the Manson stuff. But it isn't, because this is a fairy tale, and in a fairy tale, they can just butcher the bad guys and go have a drink with Sharon Tate at the end of the movie.
again, my trouble with that is I went into the movie assuming that she wouldn't die, and my question after that was like, how are they going to change history? And I remember I sighed in the movie, and you looked over at me. There's this scene, like there's this massive time skip that happens of 6 months.
Right.
I didn't remember when Sharon Tate died before I went into the movie. I'd read about it, of course. I didn't remember the dates.
We both knew she was heavily pregnant, which early in the movie she's not.
Yeah, which I figured they might change that, make it so that like it had less impact. That was my thought originally, if they didn't do a time skip, because they were noting that on the 2 different days. But I remember, like, you have Cliff show up at like their ranch, and he like it's a great. I love the ending that I like more than the end, when he like makes the guy fix his tire and like gives him like 3 slams to the face.
That was really satisfying.
That was so fun. After seeing that entire scene, it's so great.
Yeah.
But I completely lost my train of thought.
You were talking about the ending. And
What the hell? Yes. Jeez. That ending set up like right after that whole scene where like he basically like does this crazy thing at the ranch, which clearly did not happen in reality.
Right.
Then all of a sudden they show everyone going home. Like Sharon Tate, we've seen her at the movies. We've seen all these different characters, and then like, okay, all of them are going home now. And I was like, and I remember feeling like I was like, crap. They're gonna change this so that instead of going to the Tates, they're gonna go and just kill them instead. They're gonna specifically target them. I'm like, I thought that was weak, and I was like, why would you set all this up just to say like they went to a different house because of X? I'm like, I felt that didn't justify everything else we'd seen. And for me, I still don't think that crazy conversation they had in the car justified what they did, because it's just insanity. And I was like, I'm fine with that with characters who are crazy, but I wish there would have been something a little bit more clever to get them to that point where the woman in the pool who's shooting a gun and glass in her face gets flamethrowered. I'm like, I wished that there was something a little more inventive. I feel what they did was a little too easy still.
I think that it wasn't necessarily the conversation that changed it, though. I think that the biggest change, the thing that actually sort of moves the story slightly to this new area, is Rick coming out and basically telling them to piss off. Like, that was the biggest change.
Yes.
Basically, if had Rick not come out, they would have gone to the Tate house and done what happens in history. The fact that Rick comes out, it's like midnight. He's got like a full blender full of like margarita. He's just like, stupid hippies, like, oh, like that whole like thing. That was really what drove them to his house instead.
Yeah.
And like, I think that the for me at least, like the conversation in the car about like Rick Dalton and like, oh, well, every show on television that wasn't I Love Lucy was about murder, so let's murder all the people that taught us that. Like, I think that was more or less like fun dialogue. That wasn't really like the trigger point. The trigger point was Rick coming out with the margarita, telling him just like, get off my lawn, kids.
Yeah. Which too, like, like I said, it's fun, but I'm like, I just wish we're more clever,
Yeah. This was, I would agree, payoff, not a lot of setup.
Definitely.
And your mileage may vary depending on how you feel about it.
And there's so much room for setup because the movie's so long. And I'm like,
this is a long movie. What is it? 2 hours, 36 minutes?
I think so. It's near 2:40. And I'm like, it all goes back to the whole boring thing where I'm like, I can't quite articulate exactly why I feel the movie's boring. I think I could point to reasons, but I'd almost need to break it all down. I'd almost need to like take notes and be like, this is why this is why that, to know everything. But I think we said it. We both agree the movie's unfocused, but I think we have different takes on it.
Right.
Even though you enjoyed it for the most part, I felt I was lesser so, but I still enjoyed it. It's Tarantino. So
you and I sat down with Jackie Brown recently. I would agree that Jackie Brown, which I believe is longer than this movie.
I think so.
Feels much more fluid, and it doesn't. And I would not say this movie drags, but the movie's footprint in terms of the time it sticks around definitely stands out to me more than Jackie Brown. Jackie Brown, I was like, oh wow, it's already over. Like, it's actually extremely like, it's not streamlined, but you kind of just forget how long it is until the end.
Yeah.
Like this movie definitely, I feel the weight of it more. It's not boring, but I do agree with you. It is unfocused. And whether you're entertained in the midst of a movie that essentially is floating around the sea without a rudder, that's going to ultimately be your experience may vary in terms of how you feel about that.
Yeah.
I largely liked it.
It's boring. Do you want to do grades?
I always feel like I not actually have time.
I think I know mine. What I'm curious. What do you want?
I'm kind of bouncing between two right now. Okay, this is a movie I definitely would like to see again because I think that both of us went into it with certain expectations, and I think that one of the troubles with going into in a movie with expectations at all is you almost have to like watch it, kind of let your system flush out, and then go watch it again now that you know what the movie is, so that you can kind of go into it with as pure of an experience as possible. I think right now I'm feeling this movie is a solid B. I think if I see it again, I might shift towards either a B minus or a B plus, but right now I'm feeling a B. It's a solid movie. I enjoyed it. It's not great, but throughout the movie it was good, and then it had scenes of great. So for me, it's a solid B. It's got some really good performances. It's got a really good mood. Like I always felt like I was right where the director wanted me in terms of just how I felt throughout the movie, and I think that they pull off some interesting, if probably more experimental stuff for Tarantino. Like it definitely feels pretty unique. Like it reminds me in some ways of how I felt watching Jackie Brown, especially when I learned that it's one of the few movies that he did not write. Like Jackie Brown, I don't think he actually wrote it.
No, he did.
He did?
He did.
I thought it was based on a book though, right? Did he write the script?
Yeah, he did. He wrote the script. It's based on a book. But yeah.
Oh, okay. I stand corrected, but like it definitely feels more experimental in terms of what you would normally expect from Tarantino, like the sharp dialogue, the interactions. It's a lot more of like a mood and more like of an emotional movie. I think is kind of like what worked for me the best.
Yeah. I'm amazed that I'm gonna probably go to the low grade, and that like, and especially for a Tarantino movie, because like I said, I'm like, I didn't go into this movie expecting to dislike it. I didn't want to hate this movie, and like I don't hate it, but I'm like I didn't have anything against this. One of the most anticipated movies this year. I think that this movie is poorly structured. I really think this movie could have been sharpened, and like I said, I think they should have adjusted the premise. I think you could have made this movie sharper if you toned down certain things, like shifted around the focus and maybe changed history a little bit more, just a little bit more than what they went for. And I think if they'd done that, it would have come in a little bit more solid. But as it stands, I think there's a lot of pacing issues, and for me, I found it boring. I can't quite articulate if that's based on stuff which is in the film or just based on like what I said, like with your mileage varying.
Right.
But for me, I think that this is probably Tarantino's weakest film, only based on the fact that there isn't a lot of character interactions, and I think because of that you lose a lot of the charm that makes most Tarantino movies good. So
Right.
I'm going to give it a C. But again, it's not from like a basis of me hating the movie. It's just the fact that I really think this movie could have been sharper, and I love Tarantino, and I wish I could love this movie, but as it stands, I'm just not a fan. So
Got it. I think I read a comment somewhere saying that like people are going to be ticked because of Stuckman. Like Chris Stuckman evidently did a review of the movie. And I'm wondering if like he went like a low grade like you.
I haven't
That's
watched.
Why people were ticked.
I haven't watched anything for this. I
didn't watch anything either.
I'm blind, man. I swear. Like I didn't watch any of the trailers. I didn't watch anything.
I'm really happy. I saw the trailers.
Oh, yeah.
That was it though. Like I'm really happy I went into this movie relatively unclear on like what to expect.
Yeah, I'm sure if I'd watched the trailers, I wouldn't have gotten anything else. I'm like, I always saw like the beginning of YouTube ads, like I'm Rick Dalton,
That's basically all I got. I knew who the leads were, and I knew Sharon Tate was in it. That's pretty much all I knew.
Yeah. The only spoiler is that a lot of people drive cars.
But they drive cars to mood appropriate music.
It's like, oh my gosh, yeah. Like we said, like I said at the beginning, I definitely recommend this, especially if you're a Tarantino fan. Like,
Yeah.
it's worth seeing for
Absolutely.
sure. It's worth supporting. Like, yeah, just your mileage varying. Like you said, you enjoyed it, I didn't, and it's like it's not like there's not massive things that are like different. It's just our experiences. So yeah,
Basically, it was like good, not good. It wasn't great and not great.
exactly.
That's pretty much the only real shift in our experience.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for watching. This is Three Brothers Movie Reviews, and we will see you guys next time for more views or podcasts.
See you guys.
Bye.
It was good.
That was very good.